All right, so welcome to the second half of the presentation. And so on the first half of the presentation, just to kind of just reflect a moment, the point that I'm making is, the point that I sought to make was, we have the origin of white folks in far Northeast Asia, the environment that shaped them into a people who developed a conquest mentality and a conquest way of life. And as I shared in that the first half, that their orientation puts them in opposition to creation itself. They're in opposition to everything. So it isn't just to black people that we're dealing with. We're dealing with the people who possess a mentality for conquering and dominating everything. In this half, what I want to talk about is the origins and development of racism and the conquest mentality, so that we can get some understanding of what's going on that leads us up to where I will talk about the impact of white folks and racism and that conquest mentality on black people, which I'll do next week, the second half. But in this particular half here, the focus is on white people, racism and conquest of the black world. So we're going to talk a little bit about, the black world in terms of this conquest. What I want to start with is this particular chart. Is that what I try to do is explain to us a way of understanding racism. All right, so I want us to really get a conceptual understanding of how racism works. All right, what it is, how racism really works. So in this particular chart, and I'm sorry you can't see this as clearly, and I know it's going to show up as light, but it's a little bit dark. But what I'm showing is, my intention is to show that each circle represents two different groups. So the black circle representing black people, and then the white circle representing white people, and that each group of people have their own distinct culture, language, customs, economy, geography, and history. We're distinct. So as Diop pointed out in the earlier chart that I showed, the distinction between the two, one xenophobic, one xenophilic, one nomadic, one more sedentary, you know what I mean? So there's a distinction all the way down the line. And so what we get is this two separate groups of folks. This is what this chart is basically saying. All right, the distinction racial chart. So I want us to have that in mind. Now, racism, in terms of defining racism, what I point out here is this: racism is the conscious and violent action of one race, namely the white race, imposition upon another race, namely the black race, for the purpose of exploitation and domination. It is the imposition of its totality upon the victimized race, that is, its culture, history, beliefs, values, laws, ideas, myths, desires, etc. In short, it's whiteness. In other words, it's white people imposing their whiteness upon black people, their totality, while simultaneously denying the victimized race its humanity. So for example, white folks and their domination of black people in this hemisphere have defined black people as 3/5 human, have defined us as cursed by God, inferior beings, bestial, criminal, and dirty. All right, it is the denial of the existence of the victimized race as human or having human capacity. Right? And so this is, so in essence, this is, racism, as I'm saying here, is a violent act. All right? So it is an act of force. This is what conquest is. Conquest comes by way of force. And that it is a form of total domination. All right? That's interesting. This is going to go real quick. All right? Because I actually was looking for more discussion and all along the way too. But it is a form of total domination. All right? So what we get is that, when we go back to this distinct race chart, what we get is when white folks started invading the various societies that they were coming into, they were able to conquer the gatherer hunters a lot easier, all right, because they were in smaller groups. So over time, they were able to overrun those, the gatherer hunter groups. However, they met more resistance when they came into contact with the African groups that were herders, because they had larger population, more resources to fight, and all. And so what they ended up doing was, in many instances, settling on the outskirts, and African people being xenophobic tolerated them. And in instances accepted them in. So there are instances where white folks actually, we can see the record where white folks actually took on the animal herding, the pastoral way of life with black folks. So that we see some examples of it in artwork in Etruskia in Italy. Before it's called Italy, but Etruskia. There's some examples of it in early Greece. If you get beyond the race propaganda that white folks attempt to put as though it was all white and all that, it's not that. It's not the particular case. There's some artwork that actually shows that there. And so in Southern Europe, we get to see some of the example, and even in there's some instances of it in North Africa, where they invaded, the areas and began to adopt the custom, African people as pastorals. Hence, the Tanu, who were descendants of the Nubian, pastoral people who were descendants of the Nubian, that they adopted, that particular way. But as their numbers increased, they eventually, moved invade of conquest. And so what the chart here is showing is my way of showing the sort of the integrating into the African society, but still being controlled, since the black is over top of the white. But it's not like a black domination of the white, it's a blending.
Right.
But coming into the society of black people. And this is something that occurred, throughout the ancient world, even to the extent when they came beyond the barriers, came beyond the groups that were animal herders and were able to come into the societies that were agricultural. So this occurred in Sumer. So for example, in Sumer, which is further to the east of Africa, in Sumer we get this this process of change. The conquering of the earlier groups that are out on the periphery, the groups that they come into that they were not able to conquer, sort of an integration into the groups until they're gaining more resources. They're gaining, for the pastoral people, they're gaining food. But these people are also engaged in cattle raiding. So they would come in the night, man, they would raid the cattle, go off, into the mountain areas with the cattle. And then, and so they are taking cattle, and they too are now adopting, the way of cattle, rearing. But as their populations will grow, of course, their mindset is still is focused on the conquest of that which is in proximity, to them, or whatever it is that they know about. So then, racism defined, part 2. Now, I'm saying here that racism is parasitic, and that it feeds upon the production, that is the labor, as in the case of slave labor, low wages, wage disparity, cultural product, for example, we talked about music earlier, during the break, dress, fashion, culinary, art, history, and intellectual products of its victimized host, while denying the source. It usurps the product and denies the victim control, or in some instances, access to its own product.
True.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah. So the thing that we want to get is that it is parasitic. Now, so it's predatory and it is parasitic. And so, in parasitic, it's feeding on the other. It's feeding on the other source. It's not generating it itself. Okay? And so it's in feeding on the other source, it's constantly looking for a host from which to conquer and to feed off of. All right. So this is the nature of it, and this is important for us to understand. It's important for us to understand it because as we get to historically look at racism or look at white people, we get to see the nature of that racism. So, for example, even though I didn't plan to do a lot of history here, I'll talk a little bit about some of this. All right. So, give you an example. 3 examples. With the the gatherer-hunter African groups that these whites came into contact with. These groups had a particular way of life. They had a philosophical orientation. They had a faith. And so they would come in and they would dominate and they would predate on these people and take from them what they had. This is a parasitic way. And then feed on that way of life. So even the gatherer-hunter African was appropriated by these barbaric nomads, the whites. So they started taking on the philosophical orientation and mimicking, because this is one of the things that they end up doing as parasites. They're mimicking the culture as they're appropriating it. Mm-hmm. With the pastoral folks, they began to do the same thing, as I indicated. So they would invade the society, rob the society of its material possession, but also rob the society of its cultural expression. Mm-hmm. So now they're taking on animal herding, but they also are taking on the identity. So here they're appropriating the identity of the people as well. Mm-hmm. And then the same would go for the farming society of Kemet. So to give you, to advance this even more, the pastoral folks, we see it with in Sumer, when the Gutians and the Martu, these are the Assyrians, they come in and they take on the pastoral way and they started calling themselves after the people. So that the agricultural people in Sumer are the people of Asar, because Asar out of Kemet is the life force, the earth sovereign and the governing life force. And so our people named their society and themselves after their life force. So they would be known as the people of Asar, or the Asarian, as we would call them today. So in Mesopotamia, there is the society, the city-state of Assur, that is actually under the Kemetic civilization. And this is in northern Mesopotamia. So this is one of the earliest societies that were overrun, by agricultural societies, that was overrun, and an urban society that's overrun by these whites. So they come in and they overrun and they began to take on the identity. So what they started doing is naming themselves with the names of the people of the society. So now they're naming themselves and they begin to take on the practice of the people, in other words, mimicking them. So now we get these very folks who are the invaders that you and I today are referring to as Assyrians, but it's from Assar. Assyrians. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
We get the name Assur-banipal, Assur-nasapel. These are the names of Assar that the invaders are taking on and appropriating to themselves. They create a faith from the African faith. In other words, they fabricate, a control system, because I don't call it a particular faith in the sense that it is not the same. It doesn't have the same orientation. The African faith is a way of life. Right. The way of barbarism, the system is about conquest. So what they are actually generating is a control system to control and dominate. Mm-hmm. We get it when these white folks continue their migrations into the eastern area, and they conquer the African societies along the eastern Mediterranean, of Ugarit, that's later called Syria, of Canaan in the area of so-called Palestine and Israel. And so they take on the way of these folks and they fabricate what today folks refer to as Judaism out of the African pastoral and agricultural way. Because that's what constitutes that particular work. This is where you get the story of folks celebrating and revering the sacred cow. You know what I mean? The sacred calf. That's what it comes out of. It's the pastoral way of life. And then that Moses part of Moses going up to the mount, he gets what? Writing. Remember?
Oh, yeah.
He's going up to get writing. He's getting something else. He's getting agriculture too. Because see, the people initially come in and they conquer the folks who